In this video, we continue our discussion on Chapter 13, in which we go over regulation, where in our last video we examined the market outcome for a natural monopoly. In today's video, we seek to examine how the government can intervene in a natural monopoly by setting up some preliminaries in order to go over government intervention, to allow us to then consider regulation and conclude with deregulation. Where, beginning with our preliminaries, in our last video we linked market failure to when marginal cost pricing does not hold, that is, when marginal cost does not equal price. For when price does equal marginal cost, price is a signaling device giving all the relevant information to consumers and firms about the opportunity costs associated with a particular product or service. The second thing we did is we observed that only the perfectly competitive market structure yields marginal cost pricing in its equilibrium. And third, we examined the market outcome for a natural monopoly, where in regards to the natural monopoly market outcome, we saw that marginal cost pricing did not hold in that we had price strictly above marginal cost, so the pricing signal was flawed for the natural monopolist case. We also observed that positive economic profits existed, as we saw with the standard more general monopoly outcome case, and this also resulted in equilibrium in a lower amount of output and a higher price point than what we would see in the perfectly competitive market structure, given that we do not have marginal cost pricing. So then, with this in mind, with a lack of marginal cost pricing such that we have market failure, this then poses the question of what can the government do to intervene? Well, when market failure exists in a particular product or factor market, the government can intervene to alter the outcome in that market, and they can do so via two main approaches. The first is going to be with antitrust, where this is government intervention to alter market structures or prevent abuse of market power, where this focuses on relaxing or maintaining characteristics of a market, in that if we have an oligopoly and we have antitrust going on, the government will try to prevent oligopolists in that industry from merging to form a duopoly or, say, monopoly market structure. That is, to keep the oligopoly as an oligopoly or have a particular market structure such as a monopoly or duopoly and try to break it up to be a more competitive type market structure. Where in our case of a natural monopoly, since it is cheaper to have one firm operating in the space, this will not be the most appropriate option to consider. Therefore, we will go with our second approach that the government has, where this will be regulation, in which the government intervenes to alter the behaviors of firms in the particular space, where this is the option that we'll pursue for the natural monopoly market structure, where in terms of regulation, three approaches will exist that the government has at their disposal in the form of price regulation, profit regulation, as well as output regulation, where we will examine each of these approaches individually and compare. Where, beginning with price regulation, this is when the government imposes marginal cost pricing on the natural monopolist such that the condition of price is equal to marginal cost holds. Where, looking at our graphical representation of the natural monopoly on the right, we have price on the vertical axis and we have quantity on the horizontal axis. We have our downward sloping market demand curve and our downward sloping marginal revenue curve that's strictly below our market demand curve. We also have our low but upward sloping marginal cost curve, and we have our downward sloping average total cost curves due to our high fixed costs leading to average fixed costs being the dominant effect in average total costs. We saw in our last video the market outcome occurs when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, giving us the quantity level QA, and in terms of our pricing strategy, this occurs on the market demand curve at QA with a price point PA. When the government intervenes through price regulation imposing marginal cost pricing, it has it behave as if it were a perfectly competitive market structure. So instead of being at the equilibrium point of price point PA and quantity level QA, with marginal cost pricing being enforced, This then has marginal cost intersecting market demand, such that we are mimicking market supply equaling market demand for the perfect competitive market structure, where this then leads to the outcome of a quantity level QB and a price point PB in this market now, where overall this then mimics the perfectly competitive market structure in which we have our marginal cost pricing condition holding, we have our equilibrium of QB and PB, where we see that QB is strictly larger than QA, and we see that PB is strictly lower than PA. Not only that, as we saw in our last video as well, we will also have losses occurring for the natural monopolist, as we did when we examined the perfectly competitive market structure, given that our price point PB in equilibrium is strictly below our price point on the average total cost curve, P capital subscript B, such that there will be a loss per unit when we look at this difference, and when we scale this by our overall quantity, we will have a loss. Therefore, this form of regulation generates marginal cost pricing, an increased amount of output, and a decreased price point in equilibrium compared to our original outcome. And since a loss is occurring, since there's loss per unit and overall losses generated due to our price point being below our average total cost curve, for this option to be viable, the government must also provide a subsidy by the quantity of the loss to the natural monopolist, or there will be potential for this natural monopolist to go out of business. So then, with that in mind, turning our attention to our second regulation option, we have profit regulation, in which the government imposes a zero economic profit condition on the natural monopolist, where instead of marginal cost pricing, we have price is equal to average total cost. So observing our natural monopolist outcome of a quantity level QA at a price point PA, by imposing the zero economic profit condition on the natural monopolist, this then entails looking at when the price point intersects our average total cost curve, which we see occurs at point C at a price point PC. Moving down in terms of quantity, we see that this also corresponds to a quantity level of QC. So this regulation provides the equilibrium output QC at a price point PC, where since price is equal to average total cost, we will also have zero economic profits as a result, where overall in terms of this market outcome, we'll have that marginal cost pricing does not hold, and that if we look at our price point PC, we see that it is strictly above the point on our marginal cost curve. Let us just call that marginal cost subscript C. Therefore, we still have some market failure, but an improved outcome than what we originally had. In terms of our equilibrium quantity and price point, we have an increased amount of quantity in the market, not as much as a perfect competitive market structure, but more so than the monopoly case, and we also have a reduced price point since PC is strictly less than PA, but it's not as reduced as the perfectly competitive market price point of PB. And since our price is equal to our average total cost, profits per unit is zero, such that when we scale that by our overall quantity level, we have an economic profit level of zero for this natural monopolist under this regulation condition. Where overall then, what we have then is marginal cost pricing still does not hold. We have an increased amount of output and decreased price point than the natural monopolist outcome, but not as much as the perfectly competitive market structure. And since there's not a loss being generated from the natural monopolist, the government does not need to provide a subsidy. Now, turning our attention towards output regulation, this is going to be when the government imposes a target level of output, say Q subscript capital D on the natural monopolist, and this will typically be by the amount of customers in the area, where looking at a graphical representation, downward sloping market demand curve, downward sloping marginal revenue curve below market demand, low but upward sloping marginal cost curve, and our downward sloping average total cost curve. In equilibrium, the natural monopolist has a quantity level QA and a price point PA, where positive economic profits exist. Should the government have the natural monopolist target a particular quantity level, say QD for all the customers in the area, this quantity level is going to be strictly higher than what they originally would be doing, where at this quantity level QD, they price at a price point PD on the market demand curve. Where examining profits, we see that this price point PD, or our point on the market demand curve, is strictly above our average total cost curve, therefore we'll have positive profits per unit, and when we scale that by our quantity level QD, this then corresponds to a positive economic profit level for the natural monopolist. And in terms of this equilibrium output and price point, we see that QD is strictly larger than our natural monopolist outcome, and our price point PD is strictly less than the natural monopolist price point. But we also observe, when we look at marginal cost is equal to market demand, that our new outcome is a higher output, but not as much as the perfectly competitive case, and our price point is low, but not as low as the perfectly competitive case. So overall, then what we have is marginal cost pricing not holding, an increased amount of output and decreased price point, but not to the level of the perfectly competitive case, and since a loss is not being generated, the government does not need to provide a subsidy. So then what we overall saw was, with each of our regulation options, some sort of trade-off was made, where with price regulation, marginal cost pricing was held, and this led to a perfectly competitive market outcome in terms of output and price. But for this to be sustainable for the natural monopolist, the government has to pay the natural monopolist a subsidy by the amount of the loss. In regards to profit regulation, zero economic profits hold, but marginal cost pricing does not hold, such that the market outcome is somewhere between the monopoly and perfectly competitive case in terms of the output and price point for the good or service. Additionally, no subsidy is required, as with price regulation, but more than likely, the government will have to monitor the natural monopolist for its cost structure so that it doesn't over or understate it in an attempt to try to generate some positive economic profits. So some sort of costs to the government will still be imposed, just not by a subsidy. And in terms of output regulation, positive economic profits hold and marginal cost pricing does not hold, such that the market outcome is still between the monopoly and perfectly competitive case, as we saw with profit regulation, but no subsidy is required. But also similarly to that of profit regulation, some sort of monitoring will still need to be held by the government in order to ensure that the natural monopolist is reaching their target in terms of the output level. So then, with that in mind, there's no straightforward way to regulate a natural monopolist, in that if we want an efficient outcome in the market to replicate the perfectly competitive market structure, we have to deal with paying the natural monopolist a subsidy. If we would like to pursue the other options, we have somewhere between the perfectly competitive and monopoly market structure cases, and we still have some sort of market failure existing in the marketplace. Additionally, even if regulation was straightforward, it may not always provide a better outcome, that there can be government failure just as there is market failure, where we can define government failure as government intervention that fails to improve economic conditions. And this can stem from the subsidy required by the government being too large to pay over a considerable amount of a time period, the cost to monitor, as well as the cost to monitor in terms of both cost and output structures being too high. So this then leads us to the condition that the government should only regulate a natural monopolist when the marginal benefit is strictly larger than marginal cost. That is, the additional benefit and market outcome exceeds the additional cost to the government to regulate. And lastly, in terms of deregulation, if regulations occur, they may not always need to be in place, in that marginal benefit could become less than marginal cost, where this could stem from advancing technology, making a market more competitive, or the perceived marginal benefit from the regulation is actually lower than the actual marginal benefit that occurs, given that the natural monopolist is not as productive